Hi there. I just wanted to do what is hopefully going to be a quick video so I could just explain something that people seem to be very, very confused about. People are saying Bad Buddies is a enemies to lovers program, and it's not. And people are saying even that Romeo and Juliet is enemies to lovers, and they're not. And this is something that really particularly frustrates me. Now, I've been watching the show, I've been reading the book, or I read the book 3 times now, and also somebody who read many times and watched all the movies that have come out. But Romeo and Juliet, that has been one that has been particularly big for me as well. And people don't seem to understand it. Is I think the problem here, because you see, Romeo and Juliet never hated each other, right? And Pat and Pran never hated each other. This is a Romeo and Juliet story, not an enemies to lovers. They were never enemies. None of those people were ever enemies. The problem with Romeo and Juliet is they were born into families that were completely separate and hated each other. And the problem with Pat and Pran is they are born into families that are completely separate and hated each other. But they themselves never hated each other. They may have taken the behavior that was modeled for them and used it against each other. We'll talk about Pat and Pran. With Pat and Pran, they fought a lot. In the book, Pran is quoted as saying that they traded kicks every time they met. It was kicks instead of kisses, right? They were taught to hate each other, but they never did, right? They fought all the time. They competed with each other because that was what they were both pressured to do. And that is why they're having struggles in, like, the show, and they struggled a bit in the book. They don't know how to communicate with each other without doing that type of behavior, right? So now they're trying to figure out how to communicate with each other in a loving manner because they realize that they like each other. Right? And they're struggling to do that because they've never been allowed to do that, but they've never actually hated each other. See, Bad Buddies is a rarity. It is an actual Romeo and Juliet story. Because that term gets thrown around a lot. And I think that term sort of got morphed into the enemies to lovers. But enemies to lovers is very, very different than taught to hate each other and ended up in love. Because they never actually hated each other. That was never something that happened. Right? From the beginning, in the book, at least, and I believe it shows it in the show, they were both very compassionate to each other. They did what they could to not be mean or angry with each other. They worked with their limitations and achieved the best they could. In the show, that is portrayed by them playing together in the band when their teacher told them that they were going to. Because they could have gone to their parents. They could have put a stop to that. But they themselves don't hate each other. So they did it anyway. Right? Unfortunately, that had ramifications. And unfortunately, that meant Pran was taken out of the school and he was sent elsewhere. But they worked together. And they were sort of friends-ish. And they treated each other nicely when they could. And it was the same in the book. There was never any hard feelings to each other. There was never any anger to each other, really. There was never any hate. So Pat and Pran are not enemies to lovers. They were never enemies. Pat and Pran are a Romeo and Juliet story where literally everything pulls you apart from each other, where there seems to be no feasible way to be together and have that accepted, right? Like, those are the issues they're dealing with. It is deeper than a friend or enemies to lovers plot ever could be, because it's not them that are the enemies. It is their families that are the enemies. right? Because them working through being enemies is much more simplistic when they realize that they love each other and they change, right? But in a Romeo and Juliet story, just because Pat and Pran love each other does not mean their families are going to change, right? It does not mean their families are going to stop hating each other just because their children love each other. In fact, in one of the more recent episodes, his mother said that, like Pran's mother said, you can be with a man, you can be with anybody you want to be, as long as it's not one of the neighbor kids. You know? She's got no problem with him being with a man. She's got no problem with being with a woman. You could be with anybody you want to be, just not those two. Right? That's the level of hatred they're working with. Because how do you move past that? It's not you that you need to move past. It's your families. Right? You need to change the mind of your families, not yourself. So Romeo and Juliet story, a true Romeo and Juliet story, is not really about Romeo and Juliet. It's about everyone around them. Right? And I believe it was the similar thing for West Side Story, though I must admit I have never watched any of the shows or read any of it. I don't know why. I cannot tell you why. But I believe West Side Story was also a Romeo and Juliet type of story. But people keep throwing it around like it's enemies to lovers, enemies to lovers, enemies to lovers. No. No. Pat and Pran are not enemies to lovers. Bad Buddies is not enemies to lovers, because enemies to lovers is much more simplistic than a Romeo and Juliet story. Right? I mean, it was originally written by Shakespeare, one of the greatest writers still. Right? There's a bit of a language barrier because we don't understand some of it, but he is still one of the greatest writers. And there's a reason for that. It's because the stories look simplistic, but are much, much more complicated than anyone can imagine. It is the calm of the surface and the waves beneath. That's what we're looking at. And with Pat and Pran, that is very much what it is. And to call it an enemies to lovers is actually kind of insulting to the authors of the book and to the people who wrote the screenplay, because it is not that simplistic. Wish it was.